All right, let's get started. It's a Monday. We're midway through the semester. There is no class on Wednesday. I would rather be teaching you than sitting in the meetings I'm going to be sitting in. I love teaching. I love history. I love students. And the thing that always gives me pause about my career is 3-hour-long meetings about teaching. I want to do the thing. I don't want to talk about the thing. Kind of my philosophy is like Fight Club. So the next thing we're going to read is a bit of a curveball. It's actually before where we are right now, but we've been working in England and in the English-speaking context for so long. It's just comfortable for me to stay here. The next thing we're going to read is a French unique novel. It is a novel, but it's so new. It's like when the novel is still in its primitive form that it won't feel like a novel to you. It presents itself as the literary term for this is an epistolary novel, or it's a novel in epistles. So it's a series of letters ostensibly written by a pair of Persians to one another living in Paris. Rest assured it's not, it's written by a Frenchman. And I'd like you to read about the first 50. And this is an experiment. Like, I've never read this before in this context, and I don't know how it will work. It's such a pioneering work as a novel that it might not be accessible enough for us. I knew Pilgrim's Progress was going to work because it's written at a low level. This is written at a pretty high level, but I want to use it to explore one of the themes that starts to come up a lot in Voltaire is, and we forget this when we study early modern Europe, the space that we think of as being Europe is actually really small compared to where it is today, right? So you have a unified kind of Dutch Anglo Empire here. You've got France and you've got Spain. And those are the three things on the map that look recognizably modern. But then you have this kind of smorgasbord of Germany that doesn't exist yet, and Italy. And this stuff is sort of Central Europe. You've got the Habsburg dynasty there. That's not a modern thing. And then you've got these Eastern nations, Poland, Lithuania, and Muscovy. And actually, I hadn't planned on this, but if you think about kind of where the world is ripped apart today, like it's right there. The question of, is Ukraine a part of Europe or not a part of Europe? Is it Russian? Like it's right there, actually, because this half of Ukraine is, and that half is, it's a mess. But the Ottoman Empire is right there. And notice how much of what's today Europe the Ottoman Empire still possesses. And so France is sort of becoming conscious of the non-European West. And we see this in Voltaire. There's this real sense of maybe we don't actually have a monopoly on knowledge. There's this sort of, with doubt and skepticism sort of comes this elite kind of wondering, maybe the other understands something that we don't. Maybe that the Persians understand something that we don't. So this is one of the things I'm really interested in, and is to what degree does a European's understanding of themselves as a European depend on what it thinks about non-Europeans, right? This becomes really loaded for us today when we ask a slightly different question in America, which is to what extent does people's understanding of being white depend on their understanding of non-white? The way that we think about the other is a kind of really core part of our contemporary troubles in the West. And so, yeah, I'm really interested, but I've never really tried to assign it in this context. So I don't know if I've just thrown a hand grenade into the room or not. Like, I don't know what he's going to say, if it's going to be provocative or politically incorrect, or so I'm not assigning it to metal. I'm curious. I like to read new books. So we'll see what happens. Today's subject is to talk about this relationship, and this isn't a surprise because this is something you figured out I'm obviously kind of obsessed with, this relationship between faith and reason. And in the context of the whole Western intellectual tradition, I hope you've learned that these two things are tightly connected. So for Augustine, faith is not separated from reason. For Dante, faith is really tightly connected with reason. And for people living in this age too, faith and reason are close, But this is the moment when I think we begin to see them disentangle, especially as we read Voltaire. So the Voltaire position will become kind of this suspicion, this skepticism, this doubt will become the defining position of the West. But what I'd suggest is when we live in this age, when we're in the age of the 18th century, we really are living in the age of Wesley, not the age of Voltaire. And so I'm going to give him like front and center, and then we'll get to the end and we'll be like, oh, and by the way, there's this strange French skeptic who, but because of the way the French Revolution unfolds, he becomes larger than he was at the moment. Just like I think Newton becomes larger than he was in the moment. So I'm asking this question, is it the age of faith and the age of reason, or is it the age of faith or the age of reason, or what's the relationship between these two things in this 18th century? So questions about the big thing today? Okay. Well, let me start by showing you a slightly different map. This is the map that we care about when we look at 1700. It's a map of national boundaries, but they are still sort of looking at the world through the eyes of this map, right? Which is sort of about national boundaries, but it's really much more about religious distinction. And here you see less diversity, but it's also really messy. There are clearly Roman Catholic places in the southwest of Europe. There are, I mean, this is the Turkish space, that's the Russian Orthodox space. Large parts of Central Europe are still sort of in turmoil. They haven't figured out if they're Protestant or Catholic. But you've got these three dominant varieties of Protestantism that are sort of at odds with one another. You've got a Calvinist system, which is dominant in Switzerland and Holland and Scotland, and then in Boston, where America's heavily been settled by Calvinists. You have the Lutheran provinces, mostly in Central Europe. And then you've got this sort of English exceptionalism. And what Voltaire's going to argue, and I think this might be the only thing Voltaire's right about, is that there is something exceptional about the way that England does religion. And it's not just theological, it's almost accidental, but something happens there that creates a space in which modern philosophy and modern science can really fully unfold. What happens in the 18th century is to take this and radically complicate it. I'll just give you like a 90-second version of the whole class, and you can put that in your notes, and then we'll try and unpack it. But this is the main idea for today. That this new thing emerges called evangelicalism. Evangelicalism's become a bit of a dirty word in the last 10 years because of its connection to Donald Trump. But for 3 centuries, it was a major force in politics and religion, because what evangelicalism did was to divide each of these Protestantism. So now there are evangelical and non-evangelical Lutherans, there are evangelical and non-evangelical Calvinists, and there are evangelical and non-evangelical Anglicans. And so this essentially doubles the religious diversity of the English-speaking West. And that's a really big deal, because as Voltaire points out, if you live in a space with 2 or 3 religious factions, what do you have? You have war, you have chaos. And if you live in a space with 30 religious factions, you have, Voltaire says, you have peace. I think he's right about that. And so this process, I'm of Wesleyan belief. And so you might think that I'm really excited about this because I'm Wesleyan. And okay, you're not wrong. I think Wesley is important because I'm Wesleyan. But if I were a Marxist, I would think that Wesley was really important because of the way that it sets up modern Europe. That makes sense? And I'll try and vindicate that. Now we haven't talked much about America, which is I find astonishing, because I'm an Americanist, and normally when I teach a course, we do nothing but talk about America. So I sort of assume that everyone knows all this American stuff, and you really don't. So this is just here as a reminder that America was founded by Puritans, by Pilgrims, by Baptists, by people of the John Bunyan set who were radical dissenters, and even in the parts of the South where America was founded by Anglican planters, it wasn't quite the English way. The American system even more than England, I'm going to talk about, is an incredibly diverse, factionalized place that's focused on faith and reason at the same time. It's like, to the extent that I'm describing something that makes England a little unique, it makes America weird, like in unbelievable ways. But let me start by kind of giving you the background on where this, actually, no, before we do this, we probably need a definition in terms, because it just occurs to me that I'm used to teaching this, and usually I teach something like this in a junior level class. I teach a whole class on American evangelicalism that I'm actually going to teach, not in the fall, but in the following spring. It's like, if you hate this, don't take it. If you're really interested in this kind of content, you might think about taking this your sophomore year. But in that context, I don't really have to define evangelicalism. And it occurs to me that, like, this is probably worth 2 minutes. Think about what this thing is, because some of you grow up with it. My guess is probably over half of you have just sort of heard the word used and you're not actually sure what it means. So what do, say, evangelicals think in comparison to ordinary Lutherans or Roman Catholics, or what makes an evangelical kind of distinct? Any ideas? Didn't read on this, but yeah.
This might be about wrong, but
That's totally fine. I say something 100% wrong at least once a class, and nobody calls me on it.
cool. I think evangelical would make someone different within an evangelical practice.
Yeah.
It's basically the way in which they show their faith.
Okay.
Like a lot of people, like especially during this time, I'm sure the faith was in the church.
Yes.
Like it didn't really reach out anywhere.
Right.
Evangelical are
Yeah.
people that go out and either preach it to others, or like they're the ones that try to convert others.
Yeah.
Bring people to
Okay.
the church.
Okay. So you've hit 3 and 4, which is really good. These are the things that make evangelicals different from a lot of other varieties. So if you take a John Bunyan type and add to them this intense belief in conversion and this intense belief in activism, then you have something like an evangelical. Yeah.
This might also be wrong, but is it like so evangelical believes that there's like a personal connection to that, but
Yes.
the other side is more he's like an overruling figure and there's not.
Yeah, that's good. One can believe that without being an evangelical, but that's necessary. That's unnecessary but not sufficient. That's true for Luther too, right? So part of what you're describing is something that makes you Protestant, but maybe not all Protestants would believe that. Yeah, but that becomes a core part of this, and we saw that in Bunyan too, right? So that's a kind of a non-conforming Protestant. It's really good. What are other core things that maybe they would share with Lutherans or Calvinists, or ways in which evangelicals and Roman Catholics would differ? The big one is going to be the Bible, right? They both believe in the Bible, but they read the Bible in really different ways. So an evangelical is going to insist on kind of a Lutheran, the Bible kind of above and alone, and you other things matter, but mostly because you need the other things to understand what the Bible is. It's like the Bible is crucial. And the second is something I think evangelicals would share with most Catholics, is this sort of a sense of the cross, right? These 4 things make up, and it's these 2 things that are kind of special to evangelicals, and this thing in particular becomes really crucial, right? People here at Houghton are all the time really proud of and talking about our history with the abolitionist movement in the 19th century, right? Or how Houghton was one of the first colleges, or one of the first, not Houghton, the Wesleyans were one of the first churches in America to ordain women. Like, we're really proud of that part of our story. That's this activism. But lots of folks today wouldn't kind of see how all these 4 work together. Okay, that was a bit of a tangent. So what I want to do is kind of walk you through 3 of the major early evangelicals, talk about how they changed, especially America, but the world, and then talk a little bit about Voltaire and how Voltaire responded to all of this, to give you a sense of how maybe someone who wasn't very evangelical looked at all of this. And I'm going to try to do this really fast. because my fear is I'm just going to start telling like lots of Wesley stories, and I'll be like on point 3 and I'll run out of time. Wesley comes from a kind of complicated theological background. His father was an Anglican priest and a Tory and a loyal supporter of the British monarchy. And his mother was a nonconformist, a John Bunyan type, and devout. So he grew up in a household that was somewhat complicated. His father is so strong-minded that he'd actually been put in prison for denouncing and attacking religious dissenters too strongly. So the differences between the two of them are quite enormous. His personality is, I think, due to a lot of what later emerges in Methodism. One of his biographers describes him as being hard driving, but also sensitive, intense, yet patient, detached, but charming, self-disciplined, but also really emotional, opinionated, yet curious, open to advice, yet unwilling to be pressured, brusque with people he thought were bad faith, yet tolerant of people who disagreed with him. So this is John Wesley. Wesley's family are so his father's a pastor, which means that he has social status, but he's poor. So he goes to Oxford on a scholarship. That means he gets to go to a really good college, but that he has to do kind of service work for other students. In those days, there were gentlemen who could afford to pay the full scholarship, and then ordinary people, like this would have been me as a college student. And if you couldn't pay the salary, you were assigned to kind of do the laundry and wait table for a student that could. I mean, imagine what the class divisions in our cafeteria would look like if like a quarter of you were sitting eating at high table, and the other 3/4 of you were serving food to your own peers. I mean, so Oxford was a badly class divided place. Wesley has enough time to get a first-rate education, but he doesn't get the kind of social connection he needs to really get a good parish. And he's there in the 1720s, and he develops this passionate desire to become as good at his faith as he can. He and his brother Charles and another young man named George Whitfield form this group that they call the Holy Club. And they meet daily, they pray, they fast, they're trying to become as righteous as they can. And they pair this with deep study. So for these people, faith and reason are not at odds. He thinks he can be, in order to be the best Christian possible, he needs to be the best student that he can. And he is ridiculed for this by the social elites and by the people who are privileged. They don't want much to do with him. His family, when he graduates, wants him to come back to Epworth, where his father had been the pastor, and be the pastor there. He doesn't want to do it. And instead, he decides he's going to go be a missionary in Georgia. So this really passionate, enthusiastic man gets on the boat. Georgia at this point is a newly founded colony. There are like a few hundred people on the shore. It's mostly populated by Native Americans. And they're attempting to set up plantations on the Savannah River. Wesley's tour in Georgia, I could tell, like, if you're a guy, like I could tell you, don't be like John Wesley stories that would last about 40 minutes. His mission is a train wreck. He's not a very good preacher. He's really fussy. He falls madly in love with an elite young woman who's way above his station, and he so creeps her out that she runs into a rash engagement with somebody else just so she can get John Wesley off her back. And he is so convinced that he's holy and this other guy is a jerk that he bans him from Holy Communion. Like, just, he's got lots of issues. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done in him. So he's a very pious young man. His brother goes, his brother's supposed to be secretary to the governor. That doesn't work all that well. Eventually, he sort of sneaks out of Georgia on the boat and doesn't tell anyone that he's going because he's in such disgrace. He returns to England in 1738, kind of just, no, 28, it's gotta be 28, questioning everything really. And this is the moment in which he has this experience this little short piece that I assigned, right? It's called his Aldersgate Street experience. And if I were to say hypothetically put Aldersgate on the exam as an ID, this is exactly what I'm referring to. It's this his own personal kind of conversion experience. Wesley has deep encounter with this sort of thing. He's been soaked in scripture at Oxford. He's got a really deep theology, but he doesn't really feel like he has a personal encounter with God or a sense that he's actually like able to overcome sin and temptation. And this for Wesley is like the main thing. This Aldersgate experience, it helps him to see that what he needs is actually spiritual discipline. So he goes on a tour, he goes to Europe, to a group of really pious Germans called the Moravians, where he begins to sort of learn how to focus on devotion and holiness, and rather than just abstract theology. So then, and I'm not saying like he turns away from theology. For Wesley, it's a both and. He then reads a really famous revival account that's on my next slide, a piece by Jonathan Edwards, and decides, hey, maybe I could try to preach and do revivals like this. And as he does this thing that I'll talk to you about in a little bit, he becomes enormously successful. And in this environment, then this thing that we call evangelicalism emerges. So Methodism and evangelicalism aren't the same thing. Methodism is this focus on discipline, on piety, for which I think contemporary Wesleyans are somewhat famous, but evangelicalism is something broader. It's this sort of theological approach that's characterized by these four points. Wesley, as he converts people, organizes them into this structure that becomes really influential in Western history. It's a bit confusing because it's called the class system. By that, he doesn't mean the working classes. So these two things are different. But if we had a revival service here and Wesley preached and say 15 of you had conversion experiences, the first thing that Wesley would do is he would put the 15 of you into 4 small groups. So this small group method is core to the way that Wesley actually operated. The Houghton Wesleyan Church, I'm on the discipleship committee there, and we did an experiment with it. We actually formed a class and tried to do Wesley's thing and see what happened last summer. It was actually really, really amazing. It's a different way of approaching spiritual development because it doesn't assume that the people in charge of it know anything. I mean, Wesley's really brilliant, but it's a sort of life together movement where a small number of you get into accountability with each other and you talk about how you need to grow. So as ordinary people in England push into this system, it leads to a sort of spiritual renaissance in the morality of the working classes. So the sort of people in Bunyan's book that he dismisses as kind of loud and brutish and hard drinking, and like England is a mess at the beginning of the 18th century. But ordinary working class folks become Methodist and they start disciplining themselves. And if for no other reason, Wesley's a major figure in contemporary Marxist history. I don't know if I would call it a privilege, but when I was in grad school at the University of Maryland, I studied with 2 or 3 of the more prominent Marxist historians in America. And like, listen, I heard more about John Wesley from the Marxists than I did from the people who taught religious history in the department. Like the Marxists were obsessed with Wesley. Why? Because Wesley did more to kind of help the working classes than all of the social activists of the 19th century. And so as people, and the historian said, like, part of what it did is it created this religious solidarity among people who were ordinary. Because like rich people don't become Methodists, aristocrats don't become Methodists, ordinary people do. And this discipline sort of allowed them to begin to become prosperous and successful. And it was a sort of, Protestant work ethic for the English poor. Now, American Methodism is a bit different than European Methodism, in part because like in England, all of the Methodists are also Anglican. So this isn't a separate church, but it creates Voltaire would say it creates a sect within the church. So there are English Methodists, and then there are Anglican non-Methodists, and they're all in church together. So what makes you a Methodist is the fact that you go to a class. Like it's a Tuesday night Bible study. You know, if you go to missions fellowship, that might make you a something. So you would be this and this, and it's a sort of it gave you a really strong identity. American Methodism then becomes really powerful after the American Revolution because they stopped taking orders from England, and they build huge numbers among people who are really poor. Two groups in particular: Westerners who weren't well evangelized by the elites, and then also African Americans who were completely untouched by the dominant American religious movement. But like when Frederick Douglass becomes a Methodist, and Frederick Douglass, when he moves out of slavery, becomes like a class leader. And this is part of the way he, as a free person, with like virtually no experience in like leadership, learns how to speak, learns how to become an activist. And that's the space from which he gets the skills that he can become an abolitionist. So Wesley is this is an important slice of Today we tend to think about, again, because of Trump, we use the word evangelical and we connect it to the kind of the far right in America. But like in 1750, Methodists wouldn't have been seen as being on the far right. They would have been seen as like, right, really devout in their faith, but also determined to make the world a better place and to reach out and help people who were at the bottom. Now, that's one side of the story, and it sort of layers over this other side of the story because the American story and the Wesleyan story are happening at the same time. Wesley never really comes back to America, to be honest. The Georgia trip was such a disaster that he sends his agents to America, but almost all of Wesley's revival work happens in England. But he has this approach, and especially this organization that becomes really influential to evangelicalism. I want to take a look at this map. Because America was settled by people from all over the West, you'll discover that America is actually an astonishingly religiously diverse place. Now, the South is largely Anglican, and the North is Puritan, but the middle states, including New York, where we now live, were basically settled by people from everywhere. So you would have Lutherans, Baptists, Presbyterians, Anglicans, Quakers, Dutch Reformed, German Reformed, French Reformed, like all just sort of mixed up together. So the sorts of things that Voltaire is saying about religious diversity, I mean, they're true in England, but they're really true in New York City, where you've got dozens of different places to worship. And this is part of what makes the American approach kind of unique. I want to tell you a little bit about this set of revivals. And for the sake of time, like there are more than two great revival preachers. But if you understand these two careers, you'll get a sense of the careers of the whole. So this is Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. These revivals take place really along a 30-year time period. That's a long swath of time. And during these 30 years, Jonathan Edwards lived in central Massachusetts, Western Massachusetts, and then for a year he went to be president of Princeton and then he died. He was really significant as a philosopher and as an innovator, but he was basically like the pastor who stayed in place the whole time. Whitefield is different. Whitefield had been a companion of Wesley at Oxford, and he becomes a traveling evangelist. So between 1739 and I think he dies in 1772 or 1773. So he has 13 journeys to America, and he might be the first person to have actually been to and preached in all 13 colonies. Some scholars call him the first American, although he dies before the Revolution, because he's the first person to really be everywhere and talk to everyone and help to create this distinctly American consciousness. We should talk a little bit about the what and the why questions, though. You guys ever seen a revival? This used to be like a really common part of Houghton history, and it was, I don't know, it's been a long time since I've seen a revival, but when I was a little kid, they still happened. So you might have seen one. Like what exactly is a revival? Revival and evangelism aren't quite the same thing. Yeah, go for it.
It's not like not a rally. But
Yeah.
like a big meeting.
Yeah.
Like people up about.
Yeah. it's like, it's a mass meeting. And lots of times it's not even targeted specifically at one church, although it could be. But it's so Wesley and Whitfield almost had this advantage because lots of times they would show up in town and the local pastors would disagree with them, be really upset about the radicalism of their thought. And so they would forbid them from using their churches. You can't be a guest speaker in my church. So that would be like, if that happened here, Dean Jordan would be like, nope, sorry, too radical, not going to speak in Houghton. So they would go have a service at the Field of Dreams, right? And you might have 2,000 people show up in a place like Houghton. And they would be people from like all these different denominational perspectives. And so it was a kind of interdenominational experience. And what united people was their two things. I mean, sort of curiosity, but also a sense that something was broken about the present system. It seemed to people, and most of these people are Protestants, they had a sense that like the Reformation was onto something, but it had grown really cold, that people were no longer really interested in it. And the theology had become really formal and really stale. And people were sort of Christian or not Christian based on whether they'd been baptized into a church and whether they had exactly precise theological positions. And look, Wesley's not against precise theology. He just wants to say the Christian life is about more than that. It's about what he calls in his journal, having a heart warmed. So it's not just about right heads, it's about right hearts, having the right heart toward Christ. And so a revival it was controversial, it was interesting, it was exciting. When Whitfield would come to town, he would generally have gotten local people who he thought would be on his side to start up a little controversy ahead of time. This is before Facebook, but like today, people would get into a Facebook argument about theology and they would like, the debate would start before he got there. He would be banned from the pulpit. He would show up at the field. And okay, this is also kind of strange, but this is before like television, before sporting events, before like, there wasn't a lot to do in America. There's no real theater. And so like thousands of people would show up. People would hear that he was going to be there on a Tuesday afternoon, and people would walk from Arcade. Like people would come from like a long ways away to hear this and see this. So this was like a big social occasion. This is one of the first things that sort of, this experience would sort of bind people in the community together. I'm getting carried away. I'm describing the Whitfield experience pretty well. Well, let me finish with Whitfield and then I'll come back to Edwards. Part of what made Whitfield different was the way that he preached. Your average sermon in the days of John Bunyan was delivered something like this. The pastor would put on his glasses and he would have a carefully prepared set of sermon notes. And he would read deliberately, word for word, all of the words on his paper, making occasional nervous eye contact with the audience. And it was a very kind of precise but boring enterprise. Whitfield had been trained on the stage before he decided he wanted to be a pastor. So it was like a show. People talked about him as like, you would go to his revival service and he would describe to you the process of becoming a Christian and the new birth. And people would say it was like watching him give birth on stage. It was just like, it was spectacular, it was emotional, it was wild. He would tell stories, he would act them out, and it was really compelling. And as he did that, other people would sort of pick it up and try to do the same thing. And he changed the way people preached in America. It was really never the same again. Another thing he did was get into a lot of controversy, and that maybe this wasn't such a good idea, but sometimes he would come to town, have 2 or 3 conversations with the local pastors, and then he would say, your pastor's not a Christian. Dean Jordan doesn't describe having a conversion experience. I won't pick on Dean Jordan, that's actually dangerous. Dr. Esch, who's teaching you theology, like I've had a conversation with him and he can't describe having a conversion experience. So Dr. Esch is going to hell. Why are you having your education supervised by someone like him? Like you need a real experience with God. Come to the Field of Dreams and let me tell you about it. Like you come into town and you convince people that half of their pastors are going to hell and then people are screaming at each other. This actually turns out to be a really exciting thing because it trains ordinary people to think for themselves. Like this happens a little bit with the Protestant Reformation, but in the context of these revivals, people get really fired up and angry about what's happening. So they start, like, this is before Twitter or Facebook, but it had the same function in local communities. One person would write a pamphlet supporting Whitefield, and another person would write a pamphlet denouncing him. And so the printers like keep printing and printing and printing, and they're making a lot of money. One of Whitefield's most loyal supporters in America was a guy by the name of Ben Franklin, right? Ben Franklin's a Voltaire type. He's a doubter. He's a skeptic. He doesn't believe a word of it, but he loves Whitefield. Why? Because anytime he comes to town, he sells a lot of newspapers and pamphlets. And so this is creating a new kind of Western culture, a space where debates happen in the public square and people are like arguing about theology. Whereas academic debates that Luther was engaged in were primarily taking place between university-trained theologians in a debating society sense. That's what the 95 Theses were. This is not as sophisticated, but like the people are doing it for themselves and they're making their own choice. Now, virtually everyone in this society would have considered themselves already a Christian. So we're not talking about people like ceasing to be Hindu and becoming Christian, or ceasing to be Buddhist and becoming Christian. That's not what this is about at all. What you get is the debate between sort of two kinds of Christians. I guess I'm going to skip Edwards for now. We'll come back. He's really interesting, but for the sake of time. This is the section I'm on right now. So Americans divided, and they divided between two kinds of Christians, between people they call old light and people they call new light. Let's take Presbyterians, because the church is really divided and it was really popular in America. Old light Presbyterians would say, you want to be a Presbyterian? This is how you do it. You're baptized into the Presbyterian church as an infant, and you are catechized, and this is the Westminster Catechism. Believe everything that this catechism says, and go to church and pay your taxes and get a pastor who's university educated from the University of Edinburgh. And he'll kind of help you maintain your Scottish culture. And this is what it means to be a respectable Christian. And the new light types are like, do you not understand what this is about? Like, they'll continue to baptize you if you're a baby, but like, that's not what this is about. You need to have a conversion experience. And it's not just about believing the Westminster Confession stuff, it's feeling it in your heart and starting to live the holy life that God has called you to. And even more radical, maybe you don't need a pastor who has a university degree. Maybe they don't need to have gone to the University of Edinburgh. Maybe it could be somebody who goes to the Log Cabin College just down the river. Actually, the Log Cabin College eventually becomes Princeton, so like it's a real thing. But at the time, it kind of seemed like a Mickey Mouse university with not the real thing. So these two groups rip each other apart, and this happens inside the Presbyterian Church and inside the Congregational Church and inside like almost every major denomination. People are screaming, and so this is when Voltaire comes along. Should we talk about Voltaire for the last few minutes? This diversity that's emerging is something that Voltaire comments on a lot. I think one of the other legacies, though, just while I'm at it, is this point I made earlier about this print culture. Like, it's a good thing if you want to throw an American Revolution to have a class of printers who are eager to print anything controversial that anyone says. So this is one way to create a healthy, free, debating middle-class society. So America is like on the edge of the world in 1750, but in some ways it's one of the most modern places in the world, because even before the revolution, because of this culture, this debating, free, religious culture that's emerged. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Voltaire. Voltaire's religious position we've already described, but I kind of wanted to put it in print and set it up there on the screen so that you had a little bit of context about it. Voltaire is a deist. Somebody remember from class on Friday what that is or what that means? When we say deist, yeah, go for it.
He believes that God put the universe in motion and then backed off.
Right. So there is a God. one might actually refer to this God as providence a lot of times. Is they didn't like to use the G word because they didn't want people to be confused. So how does this God operate in the world? The deists tended not to believe in miracles or lots of supernatural intervention. But they loved Newton because Newton gave them a set of mechanical laws by which they could say, well, this is how God created the universe, and it just operates this way. Or they would appeal to Locke and say, well, people have a moral sense. And so God put consciences in people. So, I mean, is the Bible useful? Yeah, sure, the Bible's not wrong, but yeah, I don't know. So I assigned a long section of Voltaire, but the first piece and the last two pieces are the really crucial pieces in this set of reading. At the beginning, he talks about, like, what's the point of religion? So for a deist is not anti-religious, but what's the purpose of religion for someone like Voltaire? This is radically different than Wesley and Whitefield and Edwards, for whom religion is about having a personal connection with God that renews your heart. Or so what? Deism, it's hard for us today because I think today we're divided between people of faith and people of non-faith, and there's a lot of hostility between the two of them. Like the deists aren't actually all that hostile to the evangelicals. They don't think they're doing any harm. Well, maybe they are. We'll have to work through that. What's religion for? What do you think? Is it any good? Yeah, go for it. Yeah, I mean, that's Hobbes, right? So atheists, Hobbes is an atheist. Hobbes talks about religion as a coping mechanism for the weak and psychologically fragile. That's really hostile. Voltaire doesn't see, he would say, well, true religion is okay. Go ahead.
Like could be like not as like terribly sounding as Hobbes.
Right.
Like they would think that it was more of just people trying to understand the world
Mm-hmm.
through a creator. And they
Oh,
would,
okay.
because they believe in the creator, but
Right.
they just don't know exactly how the creator really fits, or they don't
Okay.
believe that the creator's in the world.
Right.
So they would see the religion part of it as that the origin story is
Okay.
kind of branching out.
Okay. Yeah, that becomes really, use the word understanding, and I like that a lot, because the deists are really interested in rational, the things that can be rationally shown. Because they're thinking like Newtonians. So the Wesley emphasis on faith and emotion, they're like, yeah, I don't know about that. But we do need, God did put things that we need to rationally understand so that we can have a good society. So religion is socially necessary. Because without religion, people will be wildly immoral. So the religion is necessary. Even if, yeah, maybe it's not completely accurate, but we have to have it. We need religion. Religion is important. Yeah. You see this in his letter to Frederick Wilhelm. This is Frederick Wilhelm is later going to become Frederick the Great, and I'll deal with him a little bit later in the semester. What does he say? There's this French phrase, and my French is abominable, so I won't give it to you in the French, but it's a really famous phrase in French. You should learn to recognize it if you see it in French. But if God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him. It's like classic Voltaire. What does that mean? God does exist, so we don't need to invent him. But if he didn't, we would need him. Why? Yeah.
Because it gives people a higher purpose.
Yeah, he thinks common people are kind of stupid and need this higher purpose to motivate them toward virtue, to motivate them toward right and wrong. And without this, that like society would sort of fall apart, right? He also, for what it's worth, doesn't like atheism because he thinks it's too dogmatic. Like he doesn't like people who assert this is precisely what God is like. But he doesn't like the atheists because they're asserting dogmatically. There is now and can be no God. Voltaire's like, how do you know that? Like there's this sort of extreme skepticism that comes with this point of view. If you haven't read and really want to treat yourself to the full Voltaire effect, there's a piece in the middle of this reading, and it's the section on religion, in which he creates this dialogue between all of these kind of great religious leaders. And it's interesting because it shows you how, like, why people were drawn to him, why people wanted to read his stuff. So he says, he's moving through something that looks like this vision of the afterlife, and he meets Pythagoras, and he meets Zoroaster, and he meets Socrates. Let me read you a little bit here. After enjoying some time in conversation with Socrates, I went forward with my guide into a grove situated above the thickets, where all of the sages of antiquity seemed to be tasting sweet repose. This is a scene that should evoke for you the first circle of the Inferno, right? Where like all of these great wise men are. It's like he's recreating this scene. It's very different than the Christian version. I saw a man of gentle, simple countenance, who seemed to me about 35 years old. From afar, he cast compassionate glances on these piles of whitened bones, across which I had to pass to reach the sage's abode. The bones are the bones of people martyred in religious wars. It's like he's already given you this image of religion as creating terrible violence. I was astonished to find his feet swollen and bleeding, his hands likewise, his side pierced, his ribs flayed with whip cuts. Good heavens, I said to him, is it possible for a just man, a sage, to be in this state? I have just seen one who was treated in a very hateful way, but there is no comparison between his torture and yours. Who is he talking to? Yeah, he's talking to Jesus, the hands, the feet, the side, right? Wicked priests and wicked judges poisoned him. Were priests and judges your torturers? He answered them with much courtesy, yes. And who were these monsters? They were hypocrites. Ah, that says everything. So he goes back and forth. Jesus presents what Voltaire says is a religion of love and peace. Do your whole duty. And eventually Voltaire's like, you can't be Jesus. Like, this is not possible, right? He confronts this man. Did you not say once that you were come not to bring peace, but a sword? Jesus replies, oh, that's a copyist's error. I told them that I brought peace and not a sword. I never wrote anything. What I said must have been changed without evil intention. So Voltaire's sort of creating this image of a true, pure Christianity that's been lost in the ages. And what we have now is superstition and darkness. And remember that Voltaire is writing from France. So if he hates anything, it's French Catholicism. That's really what he's trying to take down. And he's got this massive like man crush on Locke and Newton and everything that England stands for. So if you want to create this contrast between this French society that he despises, you have to come to this last piece. So this is on the very last page that I assigned. This is a new text for me. I don't know if I want to put it on the test, but it would be great. So he's got this picture of the Royal Exchange. You ought to compare in your head, like he's like, France doesn't work because it's kind of saturated by different sects and they all want to kill each other. But in England, we've got, just go to the Royal Exchange. What will you see there? A place more venerable than many courts of justice, where the representatives of all nations meet for the benefit of mankind. There, the Jew, the Muslim, the Christian transact as though they all profess the same religion and give the name infidel to who? None but bankrupts. There, the Presbyterian confides in the Anabaptist and the churchman depends upon the Quaker's word. At the breaking up of this pacific and free assembly, some withdraw to the synagogue, others to take a glass. This man goes and is baptized in a great tub in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. That man has his son foreskin cut off while a set of Hebrew words, quite unintelligible to him, are mumbled over his child. Others retire to their churches and they're to wait for the inspiration of heaven with their hats on. All are satisfied. If only one religion were allowed in England, the government would very possibly become arbitrary. If there were but two, the people would cut one another's throats. But as there's such a multitude, they all live happy and in peace. So Voltaire has settled on a sort of broad religious diversity as the kind of thing that makes a place free, right? And his vision is entirely secular. It's not even like, he's not even interested in the truth of religion. So we've come through now 3 different versions of religious toleration. One, Milton's, we need to tolerate religion so we can have real religion. Locke's, we need to tolerate religion so that, like, because we can't know which one is true with the government. And then Voltaire's, which is, well, it all doesn't matter. We'll be a lot happier if we just don't think about it. And these are three quite distinct accounts of religious freedom. So, all right. That takes us through our account of evangelicalism. We're not done with issues of faith and reason because they come up all over the place in Montesquieu. So start on it, read it, figure out what's going on, figure out who these characters are. Are we supposed to admire them, or are we supposed to be frightened by them, or maybe both?
What are they looking at?